17 years. That's how long I spent building something that wasn't mine to keep. I don't say that bitterly anymore. I've had enough time to sit with it, turn it over, look at it from every angle. And what I see now is actually pretty simple. I gave Kellerman Distribution everything I had, and when they decided they didn't need it anymore, I found out just how wrong they were. My name's not important. What matters is what I did and what happened after. I came to Kellerman in my late 30s, hired as logistics coordinator when the company was still running out of a single warehouse in outside Columbus, Ohio. Small operation, maybe 40 employees. The owner, a man I'll call the old man because that's genuinely how everyone referred to him, even to his face, built it from nothing. Truck routes, wholesale contracts, regional distribution deals. He had that old school instinct for it. He knew when a supplier was going to flake before the supplier did. He knew which dock workers to trust and which ones to watch. He wasn't a genius on paper, but he was sharp in the way that decades of hard work make you sharp. I respected him. I still do, actually. Over time, I moved up. Logistics coordinator became logistics manager. Logistics manager became VP of supply chain. That sounds like a clean trajectory written out like that. But it wasn't clean at all. It was 17 years of 6 a.m. calls with freight brokers, of rebuilding our carrier relationships from scratch after a 2014 contract dispute, nearly tanked us, of personally flying to meet with 2 of our biggest suppliers in Atlanta when COVID threatened to blow up our entire Eastern network. I was the one who figured out how to reroute through a third-party 3PL in Tennessee when our primary carrier went under in 2020. I was the one who built the inventory tracking system we still use, or I should say, they still use. I put that together with a contractor over about 8 months, and I trained every warehouse lead on it, personally. By the time I turned 53, I had relationships with over 60 vendors and carriers, not company relationships, personal ones. These were people who called me on my cell when there was a problem. People who'd do me a favor on a tight deadline, because we'd been through enough together that they trusted me. That kind of thing doesn't show up in any org chart. It doesn't appear in any quarterly report. To the old man, I think he understood it. Not perfectly, but he got it. His son-in-law did not. The old man had a daughter, sharp woman, ran the finance side of the business. Good at her job. I had no issue with her. But she married a guy, I'll call him the son-in-law, who had an MBA from a decent school, 2 years at a consulting firm, and the unshakable confidence of someone who has never actually had to fix something that was broken. He was maybe 34, fit, well-dressed, the kind of guy who used words like synergy, without any self-awareness at all. He'd been circling the business for a couple of years, doing some project work, sitting in on board meetings. And then one afternoon in March, the old man called me into his office, closed the door, and told me he was stepping back. I was genuinely happy for him. He'd earned it. 71 years old, bad knee, and he'd been wanting to spend more time at his place in Florida. I shook his hand, told him he'd built something real, and I meant it. Then he told me the son-in-law was coming in as the new COO. I kept my face neutral. I was good at that. He said the son-in-law would be restructuring leadership to position the company for its next phase of growth. Those weren't his words. He was reading, just slightly, from something someone else had written for him. I recognized the language. It was consultant speak. I asked what that meant for my role. He said my role was under review. I drove home that night and I told my wife everything. She listened. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. That was a lie. Not to her, I just didn't know how to say it out loud yet. The son-in-law came in like a season change, sudden and total. Within his first 6 weeks, he'd reorganized the reporting structure, brought in 2 people from his old consulting network, and scheduled what he called a capacity audit across all departments. That's when he sat down with me. He had a yellow legal pad and a coffee he hadn't touched. He asked me to walk him through my function, what I did day to day, who I talked to, what systems I managed. I walked him through it. All of it. Took about 90 minutes. When I finished, he nodded slowly, in the way people nod when they're not actually processing what they've heard. Then he said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "A lot of this seems like it could be automated or consolidated." I asked what he meant by consolidated. He said he thought the vendor relationships could be managed at a lower level, that his vision was for the company to move towards systematized procurement with less dependency on individual relationship management. I looked at him. I looked at the legal pad. I said, "Okay." 2 weeks later, he came to me and said the company was going to be eliminating my VP title and creating a new position, Senior Logistics Advisor. Same base salary for a transition period of 90 days. After that, the role would be reevaluated. There it was. I asked if this was negotiable. He said the structure was set, but he was open to discussing the transition timeline. I said I'd think about it. What I did not say was that I'd already been thinking, carefully, for weeks. Here's the thing about building 60 vendor relationships over 17 years. Those relationships belong to me. Not in any legal sense that would hold up in a contract, but in every practical sense that actually matters. When a carrier I'd worked with for a decade got a call from some new logistics coordinator at Kellerman, introducing themselves as the new point of contact, you know what happened? They called me. They called my cell, and I answered. I didn't tell them to stop working with Kellerman. I want to be very clear about that. I didn't sabotage a single contract. I didn't tell anyone to walk. What I did was answer my phone and be honest when people asked me what was going on. And when several of them said they were more comfortable working with me directly and asked if I was available, I told them I'd let them know. I started making calls, not to burn bridges, to build new ones. I called a freight attorney I'd known since 2011 and asked about setting up an LLC. I called my accountant. I called my wife. I started putting together the infrastructure for what would become my own consulting operation, quietly, methodically, the same way I'd rebuilt carrier networks and rerouted freight in a crisis. On the day the 90-day transition period ended, I submitted a simple one-paragraph resignation letter. No grievances, no demands. I thanked the company for 17 years. I said I was pursuing other opportunities. I left on a Friday afternoon, walked through the warehouse, shook hands with every single dock worker, and shift lead by name because I knew all of them by name, and then I got in my truck and drove home. The following Monday, my phone started buzzing, not from Kellerman, from the vendors. Here's what nobody in that restructuring meeting understood. When I was the VP of supply chain, I wasn't just managing logistics. I was the institutional memory. I was the reason shipments cleared during the holidays when our primary carrier was maxed out and a secondary relationship I'd maintained for years suddenly became critical. I was the reason we got favorable terms extended during the 2022 freight crunch when every other regional distributor was getting squeezed. None of that was documented. I'd asked twice over the years about building out proper vendor documentation and process manuals. Both times I was told it wasn't a priority. It became a priority very quickly. I heard from a former colleague, a warehouse manager who'd been there almost as long as I had, about 2 weeks after I left. He called me on a Saturday morning, and I could tell from his voice he wasn't calling just to catch up. He said, "Man, it's bad. Their new procurement contact, a 26-year-old the son-in-law had brought in from his consulting days, had tried to renegotiate terms with 4 of our key carriers simultaneously, not sequentially, simultaneously with the same email template. 2 of them had walked away from the table entirely. A third had put Kellerman on net 30 hold pending a credit review. The 4th had agreed to a rate so unfavorable that my former colleague said when he saw the number, he thought it was a typo. And their Eastern Tennessee regional supplier, a family business I'd built a relationship with over about 8 years, people I'd had Thanksgiving calls with when shipments were tight, had simply declined to renew their contract. No drama, no dispute. Just, we're going in a different direction. The son-in-law sent me an email. It was professionally worded. He said the company was experiencing a transition period and wanted to know if I'd be available for some consulting engagements on a short-term basis to help the new team get up to speed with vendor relationships. I read it twice. Then I replied. I told him I would be happy to discuss a consulting arrangement. My rate was $320 an hour, with a minimum engagement of 40 hours, billed biweekly. I also noted that I'd recently formalized my own consulting LLC and could provide a W-9 upon request. He came back and asked if we could get on a call. We got on a call. He did not mention the rate. He talked around it for a few minutes, asked some general questions about specific vendor relationships, then said he thought it would be valuable for me to come in for a few days to help with onboarding. I said, that sounds like a consulting engagement. He said he'd meant more informally. I said, I don't really do informal anymore. There was a pause, a long one. He said he'd need to discuss internally and get back to me. They got back to me 3 days later and agreed to the rate. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, but honestly what I felt was tired. Tired in a way that had been building for years, and that was finally, slowly, starting to lift. I went in for 2 weeks. I did my job. I was professional, patient, thorough. I documented what I knew. I made 3 introductory calls with key vendors to smooth the transition. I was not petty. I did not gloat. I answered every question honestly and completely. I did the work and I sent the invoice, and they paid it without pushing back. And then I didn't go back, because by that point, I didn't need to. 2 of the carriers I had the best relationships with had reached out about retaining me directly for procurement consulting. The Tennessee supplier had asked if I'd consider representing them in vendor negotiations with regional distributors. A totally different kind of work, but work I understood completely. Within about 4 months of leaving Kellerman, I had more business than I could handle comfortably, and I had to start turning things down. I hired 2 people. One was a former colleague, a procurement analyst who'd been let go from Kellerman as part of the restructuring. The other was a young woman I'd met at a freight industry conference who had more raw instinct for this work than anyone I'd seen in years. We weren't a big operation. We didn't need to be. My wife and I sat on the back porch one evening in September, maybe 8 months after I'd left, watching the light go orange over the tree line. She had a glass of wine. I had a coffee. She asked me how I was doing. I said I was good. She said, "Really? Or are you just saying that?" I thought about it honestly. "Really," I said. This is actually what I wanted. I just didn't know I was allowed to want it." She laughed a little. "You probably could have done this 10 years ago. Maybe. But I don't think I would have had the relationships built up the way I did. I don't think I would have understood my own value the same way. Sometimes the timing of a thing is the thing." I heard through my former colleague that the son-in-law lasted about 14 months before there were board-level conversations about the company's performance. The old man's daughter, apparently, was not happy about the state of several key vendor contracts. I don't know exactly what happened after that. I stopped following it closely, not out of spite. I just had other things to pay attention to. What I do know is this: they called me one more time, not the son-in-law. A board member I'd met once or twice over the years. He was polite, straightforward, asked if I'd consider coming back in a formal capacity, maybe as an independent advisor with a seat at the table. I told him I was flattered, and I meant it. I told him my consulting practice was at capacity, and I wasn't able to take on a long-term engagement at the moment. I said if things changed, I'd reach out. They haven't changed. I haven't reached out. Here's what I want people to understand, because I've had a lot of time to think about what the lesson actually is. The lesson isn't that the son-in-law was a bad person. He wasn't, particularly. He was a guy with limited experience who overestimated how replaceable the people around him were. That's not unusual. That's not even rare. It happens in companies of every size, in every industry, probably every single day somewhere. The lesson isn't even that experience beats credentials, though I believe it does in most practical situations. The real lesson is simpler than all of that. Know what you've actually built. Not what your title says, not what the org chart shows, but the actual, real, tangible thing you have spent years constructing. The relationships, the knowledge, the trust, the institutional memory. Know its value before someone else decides to tell you it has none. Because when someone tells you that, the correct response is not to argue. The correct response is to agree with them very politely, pack your things, and then let reality handle the rest of the conversation. It did, in my case. It usually does.